Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching.
Paul met me the first day I did Bebopaloola live on stage, okay? And we met and we talked after the show. And I turned around to him right then on first meeting and said, "Do you want to join the group?" And he said, And I think he said yes the next day, as I recall it. Now, George came through Paul, and Ringo came through George.
Mr. Moonlight, take one.
What are you doing? It's you. You said we'd miss out the good late. I can't breathe after I've done that mouth organ bit. Can we skip the mouth organ? I feel as though I'm singing in a sock. Nearly. Yes, not bad, that one.
Take two.
In 1962, the Beatles had signed with Parlophone Records. Their first single, Love Me Do, reached number 17 on the UK charts. This surprised their producer George Martin. He hadn't thought much of the band's music. Love Me Do was one of Paul's songs he'd written in Hamburg years previous. It was almost unheard of at the time for a band to record their own music. The general practice was to use professional songwriters. Martin told them unless their songs met a certain standard, they wouldn't be used. Martin planned their debut album to be recorded live at the Cavern Club, but when he attended a live performance one night, he deemed the club unsuitable due to the poor acoustics. The decision to make a live album was scrapped and a studio album was planned. Martin was not impressed with the drumming of Pete Best. He stated, "I decided that the drums, which are really the backbone of a good rock group, didn't give the boys enough support." The firing of Pete Best caused fans to protest by sleeping on the doorstep of his mother's house and picketing the Cavern Club with signs that read, "Pete Forever." For the recording of Please Please Me, Studio 2 at Abbey Road was chosen and a 2-day-long session was booked. The group found a replacement drummer named Ringo Starr, but George Martin had already hired his own drummer for the recording. Ringo did record a few tracks, but mainly George's session musician was used. Their first songs were done on a 2-track recorder, with most of the instruments on one track and the vocals on the other. While playing at the Cavern Club, they had met a record store owner named Brian Epstein. Brian Epstein was born into a family of successful shop owners. They owned a music store named M's, and Brian was appointed position of manager. Brian was a closet homosexual, and one night at the age of 25, while cruising in a public toilet, he was beaten mercilessly. Afterwards, the attacker stole his wallet and watch, and he ran to his car sobbing and drove away. Unfortunately, things would only get worse for Brian as the attacker, who had Brian's details, rang him and demanded money. Homosexuality was illegal at this time, and Brian found himself in a difficult situation. He drove to his parents' house and confessed everything to his mother. Brian had learned long ago he could confess anything to his mother without judgment, and the thin, intelligent lady always seemed to have a solution anytime Brian faced a problem. Queenie Epstein contacted the family solicitor. Told about the blackmail, he advised the only thing to do was contact the local police. Embarrassed, Brian contacted the police and told them the whole story. They quickly came up with a plan. Brian was to await the attacker's next phone call and agree to whatever sum of money he wanted. He would then arrange a place for them to meet where he'd be apprehended. The next night, Brian stood shaking outside a closed shop and the attacker approached as planned. When he asked for the money, Brian gave the signal and the man was arrested. The man turned out to be a married dock worker and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. As he was led away, he swore revenge, and Brian was not charged but ordered to see a psychiatrist. At the time Brian's attacker was released, Queenie sent him away on vacation. He spent 6 weeks in the south of Spain by himself. On the first day of recording Please Please Me, John arrived at the studio with a bad cold. The first song they recorded was There's a Place, followed by I Saw Her Standing There. 8 more songs were recorded, then at 10 p.m. that night, the session ended with Twist and Shout. George Martin stated, I don't know how they do it. We've been recording all day, but the longer we go on, the better they get. The group were nervous to hear what the recording would sound like, and when they listened to it in the studio control room afterwards, they were very happy with the result. George Martin was originally going to call the album Off the Beatle Track, but settled on Please Please Me. The front cover was taken in EMI's headquarters looking down the stairwell. George Martin had been refused to have a photo of them standing outside the insect house at a zoo. The recording cost £400. That's the equivalent to $9,000 in 2023. 5 months before the recording had begun, Stuart Sutcliffe, John's closest friend, had died of a brain hemorrhage. John first met Stuart when he attended the Liverpool College of Art. He was a talented painter, and the girls all considered him devastatingly attractive.
So when Stuart came in, it was a little bit of he was sort of taking a little bit of that position away from us. We sort of had to take a little bit of a back seat.
Stuart embodied the struggling artist. He was so poor in the winter, he had to burn his furniture to stay warm. When one of his paintings was sold for £65, Lennon and McCartney pushed him to buy a Hofner bass, and after that, he became the group's official bass player. The name Beatles was suggested by Stuart. He thought of the name while listening to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Stuart at the time had become renowned for wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses and tight trousers. When the Beatles were in Hamburg, Stuart met a photographer named Astrid Kircher. Stuart and Astrid became inseparable, much like John and Yoko years later. They wore the same clothes, had the same haircut, and when eating out, ordered the same food. Stuart and Astrid's close relationship aggravated the Beatles, much like John and Yoko's would years later. Eventually, he left the group to continue his career as a painter. At this time, Stuart had begun having constant headaches. He collapsed one day in art class and flew back to England to be assessed. No problems were found, and he flew back to Hamburg to carry on his studies. He collapsed again one day and died in Astrid's arms on the way to the hospital. Stuart's death affected John deeply. He seldom spoke of him publicly for the rest of his life. When John moved into Kenwood, he hung 2 of Stuart's paintings on the wall. In an interview years later, Yoko Ono said she felt as though she knew Stuart, as John spoke about him every day. After the success of their first single, George Martin urgently requested a follow-up, so John and Paul started work on Thank You Girl. While fine-tuning the song, other melodies came into their head and they began writing From Me to You. The title was inspired by the Enemy magazine's From Me to Us column. While playing around with different sounds, Paul hit a G minor while writing the middle 8, and a new dimension was added to the song. Thank You Girl was relegated to the B-side, and From Me to You became their first UK number 1. The next 11 singles they released would all hit number 1. At this time, the Beatles toured with one of their heroes, Roy Orbison. His songs had become classics already, and the group's own compositions would follow the same path. On release, She Loves You catapulted up the charts to number 1. It sold faster than any other single and made the group a household name. Their second release with the Beatles, a 14-track album featuring 6 covers, was recorded over 7 sessions in a 3-month time period. Their next single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, was produced with a specifically American sound. The group intended for I Wanna Hold Your Hand to be as big in the States as She Loves You was in the UK. While in America, the Beatles met Muhammad Ali. He was then known as Cassius Clay. Clay was preparing for his title shot against champion Sonny Liston, and nobody gave him much chance of winning, much less the Beatles. John Lennon had referred to Clay as the loudmouth who's going to lose, and would have preferred to have met Sonny Liston. The group waited in the dingy, smoke-filled gym until Ringo finally said, "Where the F is Clay?" After a few more minutes, John snapped, "Let's get the F out of here." The mood changed when Clay entered shouting, "Hello there, Beatles." They immediately warmed to his eccentric personality. Pictures were snapped in the ring, lying on the canvas, Ali picking them up, and the Beatles throwing punches at Clay. At one point, Clay said to John, "You're not as stupid as you look," to which John replied, "No, but you are." By the time it was over, the Beatles didn't want to leave. Clay had mesmerised them, and soon he would do the same with the whole world. The group were now millionaires, but only on paper, as they were being taxed 94% on their earnings. 6% was given after tax, and Brian took 25% of that. They embarked on a grueling tour where Brian took cash in hand for certain performances so they could avoid being taxed. The practice would continue until they stopped touring in 1966. At the time, John was living in a flat with Cynthia, Ringo and George lived in a flat together, and Paul lived with his girlfriend Jane Asher's family. As planned, I Wanna Hold Your Hand became a big hit in the US and touring began. In an interview, George had mentioned he liked jelly beans. Fans pelted them with jelly beans while they played. That, along with the deafening screams, at times made performing live an endurance test. The plan early on was for the group to release 2 albums and 4 singles every year. Fame never sat comfortably on John's shoulders, while George and Paul basked in the adulation. Ringo, on the other hand, seemed quite happy, but confused by it all. John at this time used some of his untaxed income to buy a house in rural England, and Brian Epstein's biography was now being written. He hired a journalist to ghostwrite the book, and it was titled Cellar Full of Noise, a reference to the Cavern Club. The entire interview and research for the book was done in just 2 days. At the Imperial Hotel in Torquay, Brian went through his life. The book was careful not to delve too deep into Brian's life. The most shocking revelation was that he and Paul's relationship was strained. The book came a bestseller on release. George turned 25 when the Beatles went into the studio to record their 3rd album, A Hard Day's Night. It was their first album to be comprised entirely of original Beatles songs. The song A Hard Day's Night was written on the request of a producer named Walter Shenson. The film A Hard Day's Night was in production, and an upbeat track needed to be played over the titles. This request greatly annoyed John, but he did as instructed. 10 hours after the song had been requested, John and Paul had completed it. John played the song for Shenson and then snapped, "Now don't bother us again about any more songs." You Can't Do That was a song written in just a few hours, and in all fairness it sounds like a song written in just a few hours. Paul had written And I Love Her on piano at Jane Asher's house, and George added the lead guitar, which took the song to a new level. He later said of the song, "It's the first ballad I impressed myself with." Frustrations began to set in the studio, and I Should Have Known Better was almost scrapped as a result. John's first ballad, If I Fell, was recorded with John and Paul sharing a microphone. Their next album, The Beatles for Sale, was recorded at the end of the year. It marked a new direction for the group. John's depression now became evident in his songwriting. The upbeat lyrics that had an optimism for life were now gone. The album was filled with self-pity and loneliness, with the exception of 8 Days a Week and one or two others. Songs like I'm a Loser were clearly autobiographical. The lyrics read, I'm a loser and I'm not what I appear to be. Paul later said of the album, the group were able to put their real personality in the songs, rather than an image used to please teenage girls and make money. They also began experimenting with different techniques, as is heard with the fade in on 8 Days a Week and the feedback on I Feel Fine, which was recorded at the time but not featured on the album. The Beatles' fifth album, Help, saw the band using string quartets and flute sections. Even though the album featured cover songs, it was still musically a step forward. The song Help was originally written as a slow ballad on piano. John later regretted changing it to an upbeat pop song. The pressure to write commercial music had been too great. Their next album would elevate the group to the status of legends, influence Brian Wilson to write Pet Sounds, and that was just the beginning.